Hello and welcome to Amsterdam Forum, Radio Netherlands discussion programme with me, Andy Clark. Today we're joined by a guest who's recently been voted the world's top intellectual, that in the British magazine Prospect. The New Yorker magazine called him one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. He's Noam Chomsky, an internationally renowned linguistics professor from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. But perhaps even more famously, he's an author, activist, and fierce critic of US foreign policy. Chomsky has equated US intervention overseas with terrorism, and he sees the war in Iraq as an act of aggression. We'll be hearing from him on Iraq, getting his take on the elections, and US claims they represent a major step forward in the push for democracy. And we'll also be talking to him about the broader war on terror. He'll be answering the many questions you, our listeners, have been emailing in to us. Professor Chomsky, welcome to the program.
Glad to be with you.
Let's start off by talking about the elections in Iraq. Let's hear how President Bush was billing them just a few days ahead of the vote.
By helping Iraqis build a strong democracy, we're adding to our own security. And like a generation before us, we're laying the foundation of peace for generations to come. Not far from here, where we gather today, is a symbol of freedom familiar to all Americans, the Liberty Bell. When the Declaration of Independence was first read in public, the Liberty Bell was sounded in celebration, and a witness said it rang as if it meant something. Today, the call of liberty is being heard in Baghdad and Basra and other Iraqi cities, and its sound is echoing across the broader Middle East. From Damascus to Tehran, people hear it, and they know it means something. It means that the days of tyranny and terror are ending, and a new day of hope and freedom is dawning.
President Bush there speaking at the Philadelphia World Affairs Council just a few days ago. I mean, the sentiment is very clear there from the president that the US is bringing hope and democracy to Iraq and that the elections are crucial in this. After the vote, the president has called the elections an important milestone. Professor Chomsky, how do you see the elections? Do you see them as an important milestone for Iraq?
Actually, I do, but before talking to that, I should just bring up a kind of a truism. No rational person pays the slightest attention to declarations of benign intent on the part of leaders, no matter who they are. And the reason is they're completely predictable, including the worst monsters, Stalin, Hitler, the rest, always full of benign intent. Yes, that's their task. Therefore, since they're predictable, we disregard them. They carry no information. What we do is look at the facts. That's true whether it's Bush or Blair or Stalin or anyone else. That's the beginning of rationality. All right, the basic facts we know. When Bush and Blair invaded Iraq, the reason was what they insistently called a single question. That was repeated by Jack Straw, by Colin Powell, Condoleeza Rice, everyone. Single question. Will Iraq eliminate its weapons of mass destruction? That was the single question. That was the basis on which both Bush and Blair got authorization to use force. Well, within a few months, the single question was answered, and the answer came out the wrong way. And then, very quickly, it turned out that that wasn't the reason for the invasion. The reason was the president's, what the liberal press calls, his messianic mission to bring democracy to Iraq. And immediately everyone had to leap on the democratization bandwagon. And it began to be described as the most noble war in history, and so on and so forth. Well, anyone with a particle of sense would know that you can't take that seriously. And in fact, if you look at the events that followed, it just demonstrated. The U.S. tried in every possible way to prevent elections in Iraq. They offered effort after effort to evade the danger of elections. Finally, they were compelled to accept elections by mass nonviolent resistance, for which the Ayatollah Sistani was a kind of a symbol. Mass outpourings of people demanding elections. Well, finally, Bush and Blair had to agree to elections. The next step is to subvert them. And they started immediately. They're doing it right now. I mean, elections mean you pay some, in a democracy at least, you pay some attention to the will of the population. Well, the crucial question for an invading army is, do they want us to be here? Well, we know the answer to that. The British Ministry of Defense just carried out a poll a couple of months ago. It was secret, but it leaked to the British press. I don't think it's been reported in the United States. They found that 82% of the population wanted the coalition forces, British and U.S. forces, to leave. 1% of the population said that they were increasing security.
But isn't this the start of a process that could see the occupying troops from America and Britain leaving, and we've seen an awful lot of Iraqis taking part in the elections, 2/3 or so. We're told the turnout was quite high.
Yeah, but hold on a second. The U.S. and Britain announced at once, we will not have a timetable for withdrawal. So yes, you can all want us to leave, but we won't have a timetable for withdrawal. Now, of course, there's a conflict. Iraqis have forced the occupying powers to allow some kind of electoral process. What the occupying powers are doing now is perfectly clear and very familiar. Very familiar. We have a long history of this in Central America. The British ran an empire, the Japanese ran an empire, the Russians ran an empire in Eastern Europe. The way they want it to work, standard procedure, you want the local forces to run their own countries. So in Poland, under the Russians, Polish army runs it, Polish civilians are the bureaucrats, the Russians are in the background. Same in, say, El Salvador. U.S.-run state terrorist forces are the military. The civilians are local. The U.S. is in the background. Anything goes wrong, they move in. Same with the British in India, same with the Japanese in South Korea and North China.
So you see this as a step just to set up a sort of puppet government and not something that's not really representative of ordinary Iraqis?
That's what they're trying to do, but there's always a conflict about that. Many of the Western-backed or Russian or other-backed tyrants rose up. However, you can easily understand, it is as clear as a bell that the U.S. and Britain behind it are doing everything they can to prevent a sovereign, more or less democratic Iraq, and they're being dragged into it step by step. Now, there's a good reason why the U.S. cannot tolerate a sovereign, more or less democratic Iraq. We're not allowed to talk about it because we have to be extreme. There's a party line. The party line, which you have to rigidly adhere to, says you're not allowed to talk about the reasons for invading Iraq. We're supposed to believe that the U.S. would have invaded Iraq if it was an island in the Indian Ocean and its main exports were pickles and lettuce. That's what you're supposed to believe. Now, the truth of the matter, obvious to anyone not committed to the party line, is that Iraq is has huge oil resources, maybe the second in the world, mostly untapped, that it's right in the middle of the main energy-producing region of the world, and that taking control of Iraq will give the United States, will strengthen enormously its control over the major energy resources of the world. It will, in fact, give the United States critical leverage over its competitors, Europe and Asia. That's the reason. Now,
okay.
Suppose that Iraq were to become sovereign and democratic. What would happen? Just think of the policies they would undertake. I mean, we can run through them, but it would be a nightmare for the United States.
So you maintain that they want to maintain control. This is an email from a listener sent to us on the eve of the elections from Iraq. He just simply calls himself Mohammed. He says this was on the eve of the elections, as I say. He says tomorrow it's going to be us who decide, and I can feel the greatness of the responsibility because the result will draw the shape of our future and will determine how long it will take until we announce victory in this war, our war against the past, against the past's illusions and the past's mistakes. And what would you say to a comment like that? I mean, we hear that a lot from Iraqis. I spoke to some people from the Iraqi community here in the Netherlands just a few weeks ago, and they were expressing very similar sentiments, that they felt they were in some way having their destiny in their own hands for the first time.
That's exactly what I've been saying for the last 3 years, and I just said it again here. The victory of the nonviolent resistance in Iraq, which compelled the occupying forces to allow elections, that's a major victory. It's one of the major triumphs of nonviolent resistance that I know of. It wasn't the insurgents who did it. The U.S. doesn't care about violence. They have more violence. What it can't control is nonviolence. And the nonviolent movements in Iraq, partially with Sistani as a kind of a figurehead, but it's much broader than that, did compel the occupying forces to allow elections and some limited, very limited degree of sovereignty. And yes, we should be trying to help them in these endeavors.
And in that sense, you see that there is a positive influence from these elections, and you see that those forces can grow out of these elections and take more control in Iraq?
I certainly hope so, but they're going to have to be fighting Britain and the United States tooth and nail all the way. And the question is what Westerners will do about it. Will we be on the side of the occupying forces, which are trying to prevent democracy and sovereignty, or will we be on the side of the Iraqi people who want democracy and sovereignty? But in order to ask that question, we first have to free ourselves of the doctrinal blinders which prevent us from understanding what is actually happening.
Okay, let's hear some more messages from listeners. This is an argument we hear an awful lot. This is Reg Pollock from Canada. Reg says, I don't think the Americans had any right to go into Iraq, but now they are there and they've removed the government. They are stuck there until there is a body which can maintain the country. Similar sentiments from this listener, Mark Humphreys in Ireland. Mark says, the anti-war movement destroyed Vietnam, and far from being ashamed of it, they are proud of it, and they want to do the same thing to Iraq. They want to abandon Iraq to the jihadis and the Baathists and civil war. That's an argument we hear an awful lot of, that the Americans have to now see the job out, as it were. What's your reaction to that?
It's like saying the Russians invaded Afghanistan, and they can't just leave it to the jihadis, so therefore they had to stay there. I mean, I was strongly opposed to that. I presume every listener was. And we should be. An invading army has no rights whatsoever, none. It has responsibilities, and its primary responsibility is to act in a way that the population of the country demands. They are to keep to the will of the population. They don't have any right to stay there because they want to. Well, as far as we know, there's a fair amount of information. The Iraqi population wants the occupying forces to leave. They believe, as I mentioned, last British Ministry of Defense poll, 1% think the occupying forces are contributing to security. Most of them think they're increasing insecurity. So yes, they should be withdrawing as the population wants them to, instead of trying desperately to set up a client regime with military forces that they can control. That's what's happening. As for Vietnam, yes, that's probably, you would have heard that from some super Stalinist in Moscow in the case of Afghanistan, I figure with his good reason. The fact of the matter is the U.S. invaded South Vietnam in 1962, practically destroyed it, then expanded the war to the rest of Indochina. It ended up killing maybe 3 or 4 million people in Indochina, destroying the country. The anti-war movement succeeded in building up enough opposition so that the country at least survived, barely, although the U.S. won a tremendous victory by destroying the country. Yes, you will find the equivalent of Stalinists in the United States who will give that party line, but they just simply take a look at the facts. They're very well known and very well understood.
Well, what do you think would happen if, sorry to interrupt you, but what do you think would happen if, the process now goes forward, an Iraqi government is formed, and the new parliament turns around, passes a majority motion for the coalition-led troops to withdraw within 6 months? What do you think would happen?
In other words, suppose that the parliament, instead of being an elite force dominating the population, suppose the parliament represents popular will. Say the popular will of the 80% of Iraqis who want the occupying forces to withdraw, according to the British Ministry of Defense. Suppose that happens. Well, then the occupying forces should immediately initiate withdrawal and leave it to the Iraqis. Now, there's a good reason why Washington and London are not contemplating that. It has nothing to do with the fate of Iraqis. Quite the contrary. Just think for a minute. What would an independent Iraq be likely to do? An independent, more or less democratic Iraq? Think. I mean, it's going to have a Shiite majority, right? Therefore, Shiites will have a lot of influence on policy, probably a dominant influence. The Shiite population in the south, which is where most of the oil is, would much prefer warm relations to Iran over hostile relations to Iran. Furthermore, they have very close relations already. The Badr Brigade, which is the militia that mostly controls the south, was trained in Iran. The clerics have long-standing relations with Iran. The Ayatollah Sistani actually grew up there, but many of them, the majority of them. Chances are pretty strong they'll move towards some sort of a loose Shiite alliance with Iraq and Iran. Furthermore, right across the border in Saudi Arabia, there's a substantial Shiite population which has been bitterly oppressed by the U.S.-backed tyranny in Saudi Arabia, the fundamentalist tyranny. Any move towards independence in Iraq is likely to increase their efforts to gain a degree of autonomy and justice. That happens to be where most of Saudi Arabia's oil is. So you can see not far in the future a loose Shiite alliance controlling most of the world's oil, independent of the United States. Furthermore, it is beginning to turn toward the east. Iran is pretty much given up on Western Europe. It assumes that Western Europe is too cowardly to act independently of the United States. Well, it has options. It can turn to the east. China can't be intimidated. That's why the U.S. is so frightened of China. Cannot be intimidated. In fact, they're already establishing relations with Iran and, in fact, even with Saudi Arabia, both military and economic. There is an Asian energy security grid based on Asia and Russia, but bringing in India, Korea, others. If Iran moves in that direction, having abandoned any hope in Europe, it can become the linchpin of the Asian energy security grid.
And you said this may be part of an attraction for the Shia in Iraq as well, to sort of join this movement away from the Western influence, as it were.
For every reason. In fact, it might even happen in Saudi Arabia. From the point of view of Washington planners, that is the ultimate nightmare.
And that's why you say they won't be prepared to leave?
That is why they are fighting tooth and nail to prevent democracy and sovereignty in Iraq. Now, the Iraqi people have resisted. And it's a very impressive resistance. I'm not talking about insurgency. I'm talking about popular, nonviolent resistance under bitter conditions. There's a labor movement forming, which is a very important one. The U.S. insists on keeping Saddam's bitter anti-labor laws, but the labor movement doesn't like it. Their activists are being killed. Nobody knows by whom, maybe by insurgents, maybe by former Baathists, maybe somebody else. But they're working. There's the basis of a popular democracy being developed there, much to the horror of the occupying forces. But it's going on, and it could have very long-term consequences in international affairs, which is why Bush and Blair have so desperately been trying to prevent democracy and any form of sovereignty, and have been forced to back off step by step. This is also going on the economic arrangements. Okay. The U.S. moved in and immediately tried to open up the economy to foreign takeover by imposing outrageous and, in fact, illegal laws for privatization. Well, Iraqis don't want that. They want to take control of their own economy and resources. There's a battle going on about that.
Let's hear another message from a listener. This is from Miguel Carrion Alvarez, who is a Spanish expatriate living in the UK. He says, forget about the US and EU governments. They're hopeless. Where to for the people, he says. How can the insanity be stopped? Or will it have to run its course and get much worse before it can get better? I guess he's talking about, the violence in Iraq at the moment. What's your take on that?
Well, the violence in Iraq is a serious problem for Iraqis, and I tend to agree with apparently the majority of Iraqis that it's the occupation forces that are stimulating the violence. The fact that an insurgency even developed in Iraq is astonishing. I mean, it's an amazing fact that the U.S. has had more trouble controlling Iraq than the Germans had in controlling occupied Europe, or the Russians in controlling Eastern Europe. After all, the countries under Nazi and Russian occupation were run by domestic forces, the domestic police, domestic armies, domestic civilian forces. The Nazis in the Kremlin were in the background, and if needed, they came in, but mostly it was domestically run. There were partisans in Western Europe, and they were very courageous, but they would have been wiped out very quickly if it hadn't been for enormous foreign support, and of course Germany was at war. Well, in Iraq, none of these circumstances prevailed. There was no outside support for the resistance. The little support that has arisen, it's very slight, is mostly engendered by the invasion. But there's no outside support. The country had been devastated by sanctions. The U.S. was coming in with enormous resources to rebuild it, and they have turned it into a total catastrophe. It's one of the worst military catastrophes in history. You look at figures like, say, malnutrition. Malnutrition's way up since the U.S. took over. That's unbelievable. It's one of the few wars that can't be reported. Not because reporters are cowards, but because it's too dangerous. The reporters are mostly in the green zone, protected green zone, or else they go out with a platoon of Marines. There are some, like Robert Fisk and Patrick Coburn and a couple of others who are independent and brave it, but not many. So this is an incredible catastrophe. But it's very likely, and I tend to agree with the apparent opinion of most Iraqis on this, that it's the invading armies themselves that are engendering the violence. They're not they're carrying out plenty of it, but the violence of the insurgents would probably decline if they left and allowed Iraqis on their own.
Another message. This is from Charles Harlick, who's from New Jersey in the U.S. He says, I have a relative who's now serving as a soldier in Iraq. What advice would you give to him?
Look, I have plenty of correspondence with soldiers in Iraq, and all you can do is offer them your sympathy. I mean, hope that they make it safely and that their leaders will get them out of there. The same kind of advice you would have given to Russian soldiers in Afghanistan. Yeah, you have to sympathize with them. It's not their fault. Mm-hmm. It's the fault of their commanders. It's not. I don't mean their military commanders. I mean the ones in the civilians in the Pentagon and the White House and their counterparts in England.
This is from Steve Brown in Mexico. Steve says, no one is talking about oil anymore. Is that still the main reason the U.S. invaded Iraq? And are Iraq's large reserves now under control of U.S. corporations?
Nobody was talking about oil all along, if you look. It was considered outrageous to talk about oil. If anyone talked about oil, Tony Blair would have a tantrum about conspiracy theories.
Plenty of the protesters said it was a war for oil from the beginning. Yeah.
Protesters did, but take a look at the mainstream. It was considered conspiracy theory, Marxist, delusional, and so on to talk about oil. Although every sane person knows that that was the reason. If Iraq had been producing pickles and lettuce, would they have been invaded? I mean, let's be serious. Of course it's oil. Furthermore, Iraqis know that. Right after the president gave his dramatic speech at the National Endowment for Democracy announcing his messianic mission to bring democracy to Iraq after the collapse of the single question, right after that a poll was reported. The Gallup poll, main polling organization in the U.S., took a poll in Baghdad and asked people in Baghdad why they think the United States invaded. Well, about 1% agreed with 100% of educated Western opinion to bring democracy. 1% agreed to bring democracy. 5% said to help Iraqis. Most of the rest said the obvious, to take control of Iraq's resources and to strengthen U.S. strategic position in the region. Incidentally, going back to the caller, writer, it's not so much a matter of gaining access to Iraq's resources. You can get access even if you don't control the country. I mean, oil market is something of a market. What matters is control, not access. It's a very big difference. The main theme of U.S. policy since the Second World War has been to control the resources of the Middle East, the energy resources. That would give what George Kennan, one of the early planners, called veto power over our allies. They wouldn't get out of line because we'd have our hand on the spigot. Now, at that time, for about 30 years, North America was the major oil exporter. The U.S. wasn't using any Middle East oil, but it nevertheless was dedicated, and it was a main theme of U.S. policy, to maintain control over it. If you look at U.S. intelligence projections for the future, they project that the U.S. must control Middle East oil, but that it itself will rely on more stable Atlantic Basin resources, Western Africa, Western Hemisphere resources. Europe and Japan all rely on the less stable Middle East resources, but the U.S. will control them. That's the way you prevent independence from developing. That's why the Asian energy security grid and the Shanghai Cooperation Council are regarded as such a threat by the United States, or the meetings right now, the Malaysian meetings, the East Asian meetings. That's a threat. It's a coalescence of power moving independently of the United States. You look back through the history of the Cold War, and it was the same with regard to Europe. Major concern throughout the Cold War was what was called European third force, which might find a way independent of the United States and Europe. And there was every effort made to prevent that. Long story. And that makes sense. If you want to run the world, you want to make sure that there are not independent forces out of your control.
Okay, a reminder you're listening to Amsterdam Forum from Radio Netherlands, and our guest this week is US author and activist Noam Chomsky, who is world-renowned for his fierce critique of US foreign policy. Professor Chomsky has been taking emails from you, our listeners, from around the world. So far we've been talking about Iraq. This is a message from L. Douglas Raymond in the US. He says, with the war in Iraq, it seems we are viewing the US's engagement in some bold, in-your-face strategic geopolitical chess. In your opinion, what is the US's next likely international move, he says?
Well, if my own guess, frankly, was that the invasion of Iraq would be over in about 3 days and that the U.S. would install a stable client regime. It should have been one of the easiest military victories in history. But they did turn it into a catastrophe. My guess back at that time was that the next place the U.S. would move would be the Andes in Western Hemisphere. The region this is a traditional region of U.S. domination, but from Venezuela down to Argentina, the region is pretty much out of control. And that's a very serious worry for U.S. planners. They expect the Western Hemisphere to be obedient and placid. And if you look at modern history, the U.S. has intervened violently and brutally throughout the Western Hemisphere for a long time to ensure obedience, overthrowing democratic governments, installing murderous military dictatorships, carrying out large-scale terror. It goes on pretty much to the present. But it is somewhat out of control. Venezuela is increasingly going on an independent path. And Venezuela is very important. The U.S. took it from the British in 1921, kicked the British out at the time of the beginning of the oil-based economy, because it was recognized that Venezuela had enormous oil resources, also others. And it has been one of the main oil suppliers under U.S. control ever since. But it's moving towards independence. Chavez is enormously popular in Venezuela. It's in fact, support for the elected government is higher in Venezuela than any other Latin American country. Venezuela is beginning to diversify its international relations, starting to export oil to China, and may do so even more so. Same is true of the other raw materials exporters, Brazil and Chile, not to the extent of Venezuela, but increasing. Furthermore, the region has left-center governments all through the region, a few exceptions, but almost all of them. And some of them are defying the IMF. Argentina simply defied IMF orders, told them to get lost, and did very well as a result. Furthermore, there's a large Indian population in Latin America, from Bolivia up to Ecuador, very large, and they're beginning to organize and become independent. They may actually win an election in Bolivia. They've overthrown a couple of governments in Ecuador. Well, they're also calling for an Indian nation throughout this region. Now, they do not want their resources taken from them. They have plenty of resources, a lot of oil. They want either to control their own resources rather than having them taken over by foreigners, or many of them don't even want the resources to be developed. So there are plenty of indigenous people in Ecuador who don't particularly want their lifestyle disrupted so that people can drive SVUs in New York City.
So this is an area you think will be an area of concern for the U.S.
It's of deep concern. There are more U.S. military in Latin America today than at the height of the Cold War. For the first time, the number of U.S. military in Latin America exceeds the combined number of civilians in key federal agencies, aid, State Department, and others. Furthermore, the training of the Latin American military, which has always been under U.S. control, has recently shifted. Congress shifted it from the State Department to the Pentagon. Now, that's quite important. The State has a terrible record of atrocities and torture and crime. Everyone should know about that. But under the State Department, military training was under some congressional supervision, had some human rights conditions, some democracy conditions. Under the Pentagon, it has no conditions. Furthermore, the military is now being trained to deal with what are called, social problems, social unrest.
Okay. There's been a lot of talk recently about how far the U.S. should go in questioning suspected terrorists. If we can talk a little bit about the war on terror. Persistent allegations have been made of torture, and allegations were also made that there were secret CIA prisons in Eastern Europe. U.S. Secretary of State Condoleeza Rice was keen to dispel the torture allegations during her recent trip to Europe. Let's hear what she had to say.
The United States does not permit, tolerate, or condone torture under any circumstances. Moreover, in accordance with the policy of this administration, the United States has respected and will continue to respect the sovereignty of other countries. The United States does not transport and has not transported detainees from one country to another for the purpose of interrogation using torture. The United States does not use the airspace or the airports of any country for the purpose of transporting a detainee to a country where he or she will be tortured. The United States has not transported anyone and will not transport anyone to a country when we believe he will be tortured.
Condoleezza Rice, a clear denial of the allegations of torture. We've also seen the Bush administration accepting the bill put forward by Senator John McCain just within the past few days, which will ban U.S. interrogators from using, and I quote, cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment of detainees in the war on terror. Earlier, Vice President Dick Cheney had lobbied to try and have an exception for the CIA from this, but the government has now backed away from that. Professor Chomsky, what do you make of the McCain bill being accepted?
Well, notice that if to the extent that the McCain bill is accepted, which hasn't happened, that is saying that what Condoleezza Rice just said is a lie. She claimed it wasn't happening. They're saying, yes, the discussion of the McCain bill is saying, yes, it did happen, but we won't do it anymore. Okay, that allows us to dismiss Condoleezza Rice's statement.
Are they saying that? Are they saying that really, or are they saying that we want to safeguard against it happening in the future?
Yes, that meant it happened in the past. They're conceding it. Of course, you don't have to concede it because there's overwhelming evidence for it. Just read, American legal journals, full of discussion of it. Take a look at Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Extensive evidence. Of course, they've been torturing. Condoleezza Rice was very careful to say, we don't send people to countries where we believe they're going to be tortured. So we send them to Egypt and Syria but we don't believe that they're going to be tortured there. How can you listen to that without laughing? What are they sending them there for? Why aren't they sending them to Holland? Why aren't they leaving them in the United States? In fact, do we have to even know what's going on in Guantanamo? I mean, Guantanamo is a horror chamber. There's plenty of evidence come out, but did we need that evidence? I mean, why'd they put them in Guantanamo? Why aren't they in a prison in New York? There's no security reason for that. The reason they're sent to Guantanamo is elementary. Any child can understand it. Guantanamo, they can claim, is not under U.S. Judicial jurisdiction. So therefore you can do to people whatever you want without habeas corpus, without judges, and so on. If they weren't torturing them, they'd put them in New York, where they'd be under the legal system. So, and the rendition, which is a shocking crime, is obviously to send people to places where they can be tortured. When Condoleeza Rice says, well, we don't, what she actually said is, we take the word of the countries to which we're sending it that they're not going to torture them. Meaning, we know they torture everybody, but we're going to take their word that they're not going to torture these people. We're just sending them there for a vacation because we want them to have a good time on, a Red Sea resort. I mean, how can we even listen to these words?
Okay, let's hear from
they've been torturing.
Let's hear from two listeners on torture. This is Noel Smith in Dublin, in Ireland. Noel says, can the people of this country believe anything the US says about torture not being committed on their behalf? This is from R. Kurt in Tennessee. And this listener says, why isn't Europe more critical of the Bush administration's policy on torture and human rights? So what about that second question and Europe not being more forthright in that listener's viewpoint?
Well, Europe depends when you talk about a country, you have to differentiate. Do you mean the elite sectors, the political class? I
guess he does. He's talking about the European Union, I guess, in that
well, talking about the elite sectors. The reason they don't protest is because they more or less agree. The general population doesn't agree. The question, can you believe what the U.S. says? Of course not. You don't believe what any government say. You don't believe what corporate leaders say. The role of people in power is to deceive. It's not just the United States. I mean, we all know that. When you look at an ad on television, do you believe it's telling the truth? I mean, after all, systems of power are dedicated to deceit and delusion, to maintain power and to pursue their interests. That's elementary. We should learn that in elementary school. So sure, you don't believe what the benign, grandiose statements that are made by leaders. As I said before, they're predictable. They carry no information. Doesn't matter whether it's the United States or anyone else. You look at the practices. When you look at the practices, it stares you in the face, even without the volumes of evidence that we have. As for why Europe accepts it, I don't think Europe does. If you put Europe, you mean the people of Europe. In fact, the United States doesn't accept it. If you mean the people of the United States. No, they don't like these policies. In fact, there's an enormous gulf in the United States between public attitudes and public policy, not just on this issue, but on a host of issues. So take another one, which is right in the front pages now, the Montreal Conference, the Kyoto Protocols. You read everywhere that the United States refused to accept Kyoto and broke up the Montreal meetings. Well, that's true if you understand United States to exclude its population. Population of the United States is overwhelmingly in favor of those agreements. In fact, so strongly that a majority of Bush voters think that he's in favor of them because it's so obviously right to be in favor of them.
Okay.
But when you have an enormous gulf between public policy and public opinion, we can mislead ourselves by saying Europe doesn't want, the U.S. doesn't want, and so on. No, we mean sectors that happen to concentrate power and keep the population out of their hair.
Okay.
What that means is there's a very serious democratic deficit in Western countries, United States in particular. The population plays very little role in policy and is often very strongly opposed to it.
Just a reminder, you're listening to Amsterdam Forum from Radio Netherlands. We're joined for this edition by US activist and author Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky, your outspoken comments always provoke equally outspoken criticism as well, and when people have been emailing into our webpage, there was of course criticism too. So let me put some of these emails to you. I'm sure you've heard these arguments many a time before, but it's always interesting to hear your answer to them as well. This is from Michael Mullock, who's in Philadelphia in the US, and he says Noam Chomsky has a pathological hatred for the United States. Like all haters, he is blinded to everything that does not support his bigotry. It must kill him and his followers to constantly be on the wrong side of history, this listener says. That is an accusation that's levelled against you, that you are unpatriotic and you have a hatred of the US. What do you say to that?
Since it's just a tantrum, there's nothing that you can say. If people want to have tantrums, fine. There is a history of that. We should at least, the writer should at least know what company he's keeping. He's keeping the company of Stalinist commissars. That's exactly what they said about every dissident. So Sakharov and the rest had a pathological hatred of Russia. They're on the wrong side of history and so on. Yeah, that's the stand of the commissars. In fact, it's the stand of their counterparts in every country.
This is from Jude Kirkham in Vancouver in Canada, and Jude says, my problem with Mr. Chomsky and the left in general regarding Iraq is that they oversimplify and fail to put forth realistic solutions. When I see a crowd of hippies parading around with giant papier-mâché puppets of George Bush and Tony Blair, how on earth am I supposed to take them seriously? The invasion went well insofar as it overthrew Saddam Hussein. The occupation was and is a disaster. Simply withdrawing is not going to happen because it would be political suicide. The answer is to reform the occupation, taking a more Colin Powell approach than a Donald Rumsfeld one. What's your reaction to that?
Forget about the hippies and so on and so forth. The person who proposed it has an idea. It's the very same idea that was proposed by moderate communists in Russia during the Afghanistan years. They said, well, you know, it was originally successful. The invasion took it over. It turned into a disaster. We obviously can't leave. It'll be politically impossible in the Kremlin. So there we have to reform it. It doesn't matter what the Afghans want. Yeah, that's a point of view. To say that what he calls the left doesn't have a point of view is completely wrong. They have a clear point of view. He just doesn't like it. The clear point of view is what I said before. Let the people of Iraq decide. An invasion is a crime. In fact, it's the supreme crime, which includes with it supreme international crime, which contains within it all the evil that follows. I'm quoting from the Nuremberg judgments. Yes, it's a supreme crime. I'm not saying that we should hang the criminals who carried out the crime, as was done at Nuremberg, that we should get rid of them. But once the crime has been committed, a very clear policy, whether the writer likes it or not, is to recognize that the invaders have no rights. They have responsibilities. There is the prime responsibility. One responsibility is to pay huge reparations to the people they invaded for all the destruction they caused, and that would include the sanctions, which were monstrous. The second one is to, as much as you can, keep to their will. Well, if the large majority of the population, let's say the British Defense Ministry poll is more or less accurate, if 80% of the population wants the invaders to leave, good, they should be preparing to leave. That's a plan. When the writer said it's politically impossible, meaning in Washington and in London, well, if so, that's a problem in Washington and London. That's a problem in the United States and Canada and England. And we should deal with that problem because it's our problem. Our problem is we can't control our leaders. The Iraqis don't have to suffer for that. But the solution, the proposals that are coming from what he calls the left, are very clear, precise, belief in democracy, belief in freedom. He just doesn't happen to like them. That doesn't mean the proposals aren't there.
Another criticism that's sometimes levelled against you goes back to Cambodia and some of your writings there. This is from Noah Cooperman in Florida in the US, and this listener says, does the professor harbour any feelings of guilt for acting as an apologist for Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge during the period of the genocide in Cambodia, or is mass murder by left-wing extremists still acceptable, says the listener?
Well, I would ask the listener whether he harbors any guilt for having supported Hitler and Holocaust and insisting that Jews be sent into extermination camps. It has the same answer. Since it never happened, I obviously can't have any guilt for it. He's just repeating propaganda he heard. If you ask him, you'll discover that he never read one word I wrote. Okay? Try it. What I wrote was, and I don't have any apologies for it because it was accurate, I took the position that Pol Pot was a brutal monster from the beginning, was carrying out hideous atrocities, but that the West, for propaganda purposes, was creating and inventing immense fabrications for its own political goals, and not out of interest in the people of Cambodia, and my colleague and I, with who I wrote all this stuff, simply ran through the list of fanatic lies that were being told, and we took the most credible sources, which happened to be U.S. intelligence, who knew more than anyone else, and we said U.S. intelligence is probably accurate. Well, in retrospect, that turns out to be correct. U.S. intelligence was probably accurate. I think we're probably the only ones that quoted it. The fabrications were fabrications and should be eliminated. Like if someone comes along, in fact, we also discussed, and I notice nobody ever talks about this, we discussed fabrications against the U.S. So, for example, a standard claim in the major works was that the U.S. bombing had killed 600,000 people in 1973. Well, we looked at the data, and we said, no, it's probably 200,000. So we said, let's tell the truth about it. It's crime, but it wasn't anything like what you said. It's interesting that nobody ever objects to that. When we criticize fabrications about U.S. crimes, that's fine. When we criticize and, in fact, expose much worse fabrications about some official enemy, that's horrible. It becomes apologetics. We should learn something about ourselves. If you're interested in the truth, which you ought to be, tell the truth about yourself and tell the truth about others. These fabrications had an obvious political purpose. Incidentally, we continued to criticize the Khmer Rouge after the Vietnamese invasion. After the Vietnamese invasion, which finally threw them out, thankfully, the U.S. and Britain immediately turned to support for Pol Pot. Well, we criticized that too. We said, no, you shouldn't be supporting this monster. So yes, our position was consistent throughout. There's been a huge literature trying to show that there was nothing wrong in what we said. To my knowledge, nobody's even found a comma that's misplaced. And therefore what you have is immense gossip. My guess is that the person who just wrote this in has never seen anything we wrote, but has heard a lot of gossip about it.
Okay, this
check me if I'm wrong.
This is another email. This is from Jeremy Raskin in Los Angeles. Jeremy says, what do you make of the trend currently underway in the Middle East to move towards more democratic national institutions? For example, the growing strength of the anti-Syrian opposition in Lebanon and the recent elections in Egypt and Iraq. Could we succeed in remaking the states of the Middle East by encouraging this trend, or does America give up spreading the gospel of democratic institutions?
Well, we can't give up. That's like asking whether Russia under the Kremlin should give up its goal of creating democratic institutions and the people's democracies. It's not a question. U.S. policy in these countries has always been and remains to deter democracy. There are a lot of popular democratic forces all over the Middle East, and they've been there for a long time. They're not just starting now. And we should stop preventing them. So take, say, Egypt, okay? The Kefaya movement is significant. The U.S. is opposed to it. The Kefaya movement began with its immediate roots were opposition to were outrage over the U.S.-backed atrocities against Israeli atrocities in the West Bank in 2000, which were extreme. That's the origins of the Kefaya movement. Of course, it has deeper origins in Egyptian democratic tendencies which go far back. That was the origins of Kefaya, and then it gained even more strength from the enormous opposition to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and now it's trying to break through to give some opening to the U.S.-backed Mubarak dictatorship. And yeah, I think instead of opposing democracy in Egypt, as we've always been doing and still are, we should be supporting it. In Lebanon, the issue right now is Syrian the Syrian involvement in Lebanon. Syria entered Lebanon in 1976 with the approval of the United States and Israel, open approval, because their task at the time was to murder Palestinians. They stayed there. In 1990, George Bush #1 gave them further authorization to stay in Lebanon because he wanted them as allies in the war against Iraq. By 2000, the early part of this millennium, they were becoming the one state in the region which was not obeying U.S. orders. So the U.S. turned against them and wanted them out. Well, how'd they get out? I think they should have been out all along. But Congress passed legislation to condemn Syria, impose sanctions, and so on. And in that resolution, if you look at it, here you show the ultimate cynicism. They appealed to a UN resolution correctly, which said every country should allow Lebanon to run its own affairs and all foreign forces should get out. That was the resolution they appealed to. Now, take a look at that resolution. It was directed against Israel in 1980. Said Israel should get out of Lebanon. Instead, Israel invaded Lebanon again and extended its role in Lebanon and stayed there till the year 2000. So here we use a resolution that was directed against Israel for its occupation of Lebanon for 22 years, parts of Lebanon, and we say that resolution says Syria should get out. Not a word in the congressional discussion, not a word in the debate. The cynicism is just mind-boggling. Yes, Syria should get out, of course. Should have gotten out in 1976 when we helped bring them in. The immediate impetus for getting Syria out was a bombing, car bombing of Rafiq Hariri. Well, unless the CIA was involved in that bombing, the U.S. has nothing to do with getting Syria out of Lebanon. There was a very important development in Lebanon of democratic forces, complex. Like a lot of one of the strongest forces in Lebanon is Hezbollah, which has a strong Shiite support. And the U.S., of course, is opposed to. But yes, we should permit, for the first time, we should permit democracy to function in Lebanon, meaning getting our dirty hands out of their affairs. You could say the same about Iraq. Iraq has a long democratic tradition, goes back a century. It was crushed by the British invasion, but it continued to function in many different ways. There were some hope for it with the 1958 revolution, which was a kind of populist revolution, which throughout the British began to introduce social measures and so on and so forth, actually introduced the Constitution, which is far more liberal than the current one. Well, U.S. and Britain couldn't stand that, so they backed and maybe initiated a coup, a military coup, to put the Ba'ath Party in. Yeah, that crushed Iraqi democracy for years. Okay, we should let Iraqi democratic forces, which go way back, to flourish and develop internally. And we can say the same thing right throughout the region.
One final email, we're almost out of time. This is from Jasmine in Amritsar in India, and Jasmine says, politicians are rarely great minds or intellectuals, they are scoundrels, as Samuel Johnson said. So my question to Mr. Chomsky is, what effect do intellectuals or great minds have in the politics of today, and has he ever been able to influence any major decision on the political leaders of the past few decades?
Well, first of all, we should have no illusions. History is written by intellectuals, almost by definition. So if you look at history, intellectuals look pretty good. On the other hand, if you look at the actual history, the role of intellectuals has typically been awful. I mentioned the Bible as an example, but it's a good example. That pattern replicates. There were people in the biblical period who we would call dissident intellectuals. They're called prophets. It's a bad translation of an obscure Hebrew word. But you look at what the prophets were saying, it's what we would call dissident intellectuals. Geopolitical critique, a call for justice and freedom, and so on. Yeah, that's dissident intellectuals. How were they treated? Well, no, they were denounced as haters of Israel. They were driven into the desert. They were imprisoned, reviled. Now, there were intellectuals at that time who were very highly respected. Namely the flatterers at the court. Hundreds of years later, they were called false prophets. Okay, that's the way it works. It's the flatterers at the court who are typically the mainstream of the intellectuals. Runs all the way through history, very few exceptions. So you don't look to intellectuals to influence policy. What makes things better is popular movements. That affects policy. That's how we've gained the freedoms that we have. And we have a lot of freedom. But it didn't come from above, and it didn't come from intellectuals. It came from organized popular movements which simply demanded more freedom. Like the nonviolent resistance in Iraq, which forced the U.S. and Britain to permit elections. That's how we got the right to vote here. That's how we got women's rights. It's the way we got freedom of speech and so on. It's a constant struggle. That's why there are such efforts to break up popular movements and to atomize people and separate them from one another and to create enormous gulfs between public opinion and public policy. It's a constant battle. And yes, that's the way to make things better, as in the past. Plenty of concrete ways to do it. We're much more able to than in the past because of the freedoms that have been won. We have a legacy of freedom, which has been won. We can use it, improve it, carry it forward, or we can abandon it. But you're not going to look to intellectuals to save you.
Professor Chomsky, as ever, a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be with you.